to the 2021 C. Gordon Winder Memorial Scugog Lecture. My name is Neil Banerjee. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Earth Sciences. And it's my extreme pleasure to welcome you all to this event. Just to give everybody a little bit of background, the Scugog Lecture was made possible in 1998 by a significant anonymous donation to the Department of Earth Sciences to create a prestigious annual lecture series. And the idea behind it was that there would be an annual public lecture that brings a prominent Canadian geoscientist to deliver an accessible presentation to the London community every year. And in 2016, the lecture was especially significant because it was revealed that the anonymous donor to the department was our own Dr. C. Gordon Winder. And Dr. Winder was a student in the department in the 1940s, and was a valuable member of the faculty until his passing in 2016, and he is very greatly missed. Dr. Winder told our Director of Development, Paula Luchak, that he had struggled with coming up with a name for the lecture. And so he actually opened a map of Ontario, closed his eyes, and put his finger down, and it landed near Lake Scugog. And so that is how the lecture name came to be chosen. And now it's my honor also to introduce the president of Western University, Professor Alan Shepard. He is the 11th president and vice chancellor of Western University. He joined Western in 2019 after serving as president and vice chancellor of Concordia University of Montreal. Professor Shepard also held senior academic leadership roles at Ryerson University, the University of Guelph, Texas Christian University, and the University of Virginia. Dr. Shepard holds a PhD in English from the University of Virginia, and he's authored or edited several books and articles that are focused on the culture of early modern England, early modern literature and science, modern theater, the future of innovation, and the future of universities. And beyond his roles at Western, Professor Shepard also currently serves on the boards of the U15 group of Canadian research universities, Universities Canada, the London Economic Development Corporation, the Stratford Festival of Canada, and the Business and Higher Education Roundtable. Welcome, President Shepard.
Thank you, Professor Banerjee. And I promise you, I did not pay him to say all those very nice things about me, because you're here to hear from Johanna Wagstaffe this afternoon. Thanks to everybody for joining us. It's a real pleasure to be with you. We hope next year we'll be back in person, and that would be a pleasure of a different kind. And I understand we also have colleagues from other institutions, and we're glad you're with us today too, and all the friends of the Faculty of Science. I'm thrilled to introduce this year's Scugog speaker, and I love hearing the story about how we got to the name Scugog. I think that's actually great. I had the pleasure of meeting Johanna Wagstaffe in Vancouver about a year ago. We were just commenting before the lecture began that it was the last hurrah really before Western converted to an online format and all the other things that have happened. And what a 12 months it's been for all of us. So together with our dean, Matt Davison, and our colleague Paul Luchak from Advancement, and Professor Banerjee, we're all thrilled to welcome you here this afternoon. So Johanna Wagstaffe earned a Bachelor's of Science degree in geophysics from Western in 2006. And she's going to talk a bit about her story today from that moment to her work with the CBC, where she's been since 2007. And we'll hear about that. She was hired as a meteorologist and science reporter, and she's gone on to have a very distinguished career with lots more to come. She's covered national and international stories, ranging from space missions, always fun, to major weather and seismic events, sometimes fun, often tragic, to the Copenhagen and Paris climate change conferences. And she's also, I guess in her spare time, written 2 children's books that help to explain to children the science that's behind hurricanes on the one hand and earthquakes on the other. In the middle of all this, she's also hosted 2 award-winning podcasts, one focused on the implications of a major earthquake on Canada's west coast, and the other engaging a panel of environmental experts on the changes we need to make to avoid the perils of climate change. Johanna is passionate about science communication as a tool for educating the public about the important work that scientists do to try and solve the world's most complex and urgent problems. And the work that she does as a science reporter seems like it's never been more challenging or more hopeful than it is today. She's here with us this afternoon to talk about her journey from Western to the CBC and to share her insights into the world of science journalism. We're so delighted to welcome you back, Johanna, if only virtually. And you're welcome back physically anytime when everybody's flying around again. And thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to you, and over to you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. First of all, I have to say, a little part of me, the undergrad Western student, is a little nervous, having the president, the dean of science, getting to introduce me. So that never fades. But thank you to everyone for taking time out of your day to join me. This is such an honor to get to talk to you. Of course, I wish we were all meeting in person. I wish that I was, grabbing a coffee from Einstein's and a copy of the Gazette and meeting you in one of the lecture halls. That will come, I'm sure. But for now, thanks for opening your computers and devices and letting me chat to you for a little while. It's especially memorable and an honor for me because the Earth Science Department at Western University was where I spent a huge part of my undergrad. London, Ontario, and Western University holds so many amazing memories, experiences, and some of my best friends, all from those years that do seem at both times long ago and not so long ago, sort of like the last year of the pandemic. But I promise I won't spend the whole time going down Western memory lane. I mean, I can if you want, but I will take some time to take you through my journey and through my path through academia to science communication, because it was not a straightforward path, as probably many of your paths have not been and will not be. So I'm looking forward to sharing with you some of the challenges and triumphs that I've seen on my journey to what is now my dream job. I love what I get to do, and I'm excited to tell you more about it and about how important science communication is right now, not just for the public, but for stakeholders. I think we're at a really critical time right now in the world where science and communicating that science is more important than ever. But let me take you back first, before my Western days, to a high schooler trying to figure out what I wanted to do in university. I loved science, but I also loved writing. I loved music. I loved history. So I applied for everything. I actually applied to Western for a couple of different programs, including aviation management. Ultimately, it was my parents that said, doing science will open up all the doors. So if you can do science, then that's the one. And the rest is history, as they say. I have no regrets choosing geophysics as my undergrad program at Western. It was not without challenges, though. First year, walking into some of those bigger classrooms, calculus, it took me about 3 years before I finally got calculus. And when I did in fourth year, it was glorious. But until then, I have memories of getting together with the rest of the calculus science students on my floor and getting a tutor to get through first and second year calculus. So you can overcome calculus if you're listening and you've got some of those finals coming up. Choosing Western, though, I knew it was where I wanted to go. It had such a great academic reputation. It was a beautiful campus, but it was doing the spring tour. I don't know how many of you, made the university rounds with your parents before applications were due. And I was on the campus with my mom. We were doing a tour of Saugeen, and we were at the back end of the tour. I don't think I've ever shared this story, so hopefully I don't get kicked off for this. We were at the back end of the tour, walking through Saugeen, and a couple of first-year students pulled my mom and I away from the tour and into their dorm room and offered us a beverage. And that was it. I was like, well, Western has everything. Side note, I later became a tour guide at Western, not only for the extra cash, but so I could make sure that other students had a full tour guide experience, but a legal one this time. So yes, Western was the place for me. And I actually chose Saugeen as my first choice for residence, but one upper and the friends that I've made live on forever. So it was a good choice in the end. The other sort of challenges, along with the hard work and the long nights of studying and the calculus, was my final year honors thesis paper. My honors geophysics program did involve an honors thesis. And I remember working so hard at it. My thesis advisor, David Eaton, who has since left, but possibly is still a legend, we worked together on looking at the seismicity on Vancouver Island with a new series of the Polaris array of seismometers. And I was incredibly proud of the work that we had done. I loved presenting that work, defending it, in front of my family, peers, and friends and teachers. But it was the reviews. When I actually got the first reviews back, it was devastating. I don't think I'd ever taken anything so hard when I first saw those comments from the reviewers after, passing my thesis on for the first time for review. Since then, I have learned that I am not alone in taking those review comments harshly. In fact, I have seen several rounds of hashtags on Twitter where fellow scientists share the reviews they got. And once you dig into them, and once I dug into mine, I realized how valuable they were and how much I was able to improve my work. And that led me to the Canadian Geophysical Union conference in Banff that summer, getting to present my work, my honed work with the reviews, and actually winning a student paper for it. And that was the moment that I realized how much I really loved the communication part of science. The memories that I have from my undergrad will continue with me, as I've mentioned a few times, along with some of my closest friends during some of those field courses. And I know that that's still a big part of the undergrad for many of you. David Eaton, the legend, sent an email out before our first field course. And of course, I was nervous, having to stay in cabins with second year students that I hadn't really got to know yet. And he sent an email out saying that we had a British exchange student, Hannah, from England. And I thought, well, Hannah, this could be the start of something special. So I volunteered to pick her up from the train station in London, and her and I still take turns visiting each other every year in Canada and England. And of course, the hilarity of the Hannahs ensued for the rest of the undergrad experience. After that presentation, that Hannah was with me in Banff, and realizing that's what I wanted to do next, I ended up realizing that my love for earthquakes and natural disasters, I wanted to expand that to the atmosphere, not only what's happening below our feet, but above our heads as well. So I continued on with a postgrad degree in meteorology. And that's when, finishing up my certificate in Toronto, I got an email from the CBC. The CBC Weather Center was looking for a behind-the-scenes meteorologist to help with the on-air presentation. It would be a 4 a.m. shift. I was still finishing my certificate, so I think I was working, 20-hour days trying to get it all in. But that was the door that opened up for me into science communication. So working behind the scenes for a few months, I think I practiced on my own in front of the green screen, because of course it was the old green screen days back then. And they let me on TV. I think it was probably a 2 a.m. shift when the least amount of people were watching, and I made it through. I think I only had to try and show the rotation of a high pressure system about 3 times before I realized I was going the right way. But after that, they let me stay on as an on-air broadcaster. That was not without its challenges, though. I loved getting to work with a team of scientists. CBC was ahead of its time. This was about almost 15 years ago, in hiring scientists to be part of their weather center. Everybody had to have a background in science to be part of that weather center. But I want to show you a picture of my first photo shoot. I don't know if you can see that. That is me in front of a green screen with a couple of other local Toronto meteorologists. If any of you know, I think Anthony Furnell there still works for Global. Nick Cerkovich sometimes fills in. Harold Hussein is also a legend. But look at this. It's everyone holding an umbrella, ties over their shoulder, hair blowing in the wind, the quintessential, I'm only going to say this once, weather girl shot. Yes, I had to work past that weather girl persona for quite some time. In fact, I still come up against the old, weather girl adages that are still there, even as a scientist. It's still something I work against in the field. But those first couple of years, it was very much still a one-way conversation in the world of broadcast meteorology. We would work all day for that one time slot at the end of the show, at the end of the supper news hour. I won't even ask how many people still watch the supper news hour, for my 3 minutes to talk about the 5-day forecast. And there wasn't a lot else that encompassed that job. We were all scientists. We all had amazing backgrounds and loved talking to each other about what was happening in the world of science and in the field of meteorology and atmospheric science. But again, it was very much a one-way conversation. And climate change was certainly not the hot topic that it is now, even just a decade ago. Whenever there was a big news story, for example, say London, Ontario hit a record-breaking 21 degrees today. That did happen. It is going to come to an end in about 2 hours, by the way. I just checked the radar and the front is coming. But if that was a news story, the climate change question was sort of at the end. It was, how hot do we get? How long can this continue? When's the big cool down? And then, is this connected to climate change? And we were sort of told to couch our answer. We can't take one weather event and connected to climate change. You need years of data to stand back and look at the trends. That was sort of our safe answer. And I'll get back to that in a moment. But I realized how important science communication was and how much of a hunger there was from our audience. And it was just a couple of years into my role at the CBC Weather Center that an earthquake happened in Los Angeles. It was, I think, a magnitude 4.8. There was some minor damage, but it happened during the evening news. So a lot of newscasters were on, the shaking footage. A lot of people were talking about it. It was breaking in the newsroom, and we didn't know how, or our news producers didn't know how big of a deal it was. So I sort of volunteered and said, well, I have a background in geophysics. I can at least tell you what's happening, the basics of the seismicity of that area, if aftershocks are expected, and then I can connect you to somebody who's working in that field right now. So that was the first time that they had sort of let a meteorologist come down to the news desk and talk about a science story. And I loved helping to explain something as it was unfolding and helping to connect the audience with scientists who were working on that particular tectonic setting. And that was sort of the start of me getting to use science communication in my everyday job. But throughout my career at CBC, it has always been me doing something and then sort of asking for permission and then realizing that there was a niche to be filled and a role to be created. So after getting to talk about earthquakes in LA, every time there was a seismic event, they would bring me down. I would give them sort of the general rundown of the seismicity and then again, look for scientists to connect to. I came out to Vancouver about 7 years ago and they'd actually created a role for me. I was still the meteorologist for the Vancouver local news, but I also got to be the science reporter for the evening news network show with Ian Hanemansing, who's on the national now. But that was a huge moment for me. I'd been working for so long to get to be a science communicator, for proving not only to the newsroom, but to the public that the meteorologists were scientists and were able to give that first broad stroke impression of the science before we connected the world to the scientists. And getting that job created for me was a big moment. And since then, a lot of the traveling that I've got to do for work have also been of my own initiative. The Climate Change Conference in 2009 was a big deal for me. It was the first time that there was real hope that the world would come together to sign an agreement. So I planned my holidays around a trip to Copenhagen for the Climate Change Conference. And the newsrooms said, well, we're not really interested in full coverage. I don't think the audience is looking for climate change. But once I was there, figuring out how to edit with my own software, figuring out how to Skype into the shows well before everyone became used to Zoom technology of the pandemic, that really opened up doors. Once I was there, all of the shows wanted daily coverage from the Copenhagen Climate Conference. So when the Paris conference came around, a second chance of hope and ultimate signing, they were much more interested in having me on the ground. But that same attitude of just creating the role and the job that you want has been with me through Vancouver as well. I got to be part of this evening news show that's continued to morph. The evening show is now with Janella Massa, still out of Toronto, that I'll be on tonight. But the idea that there was still so much science to talk about that I still wanted to put out there led me to create these Science Smarts. So Vancouver was looking for a weekend sort of magazine style show, a culmination of the news events that week. And I said, well, could you use a science story? And they said, sure, we'll give you some training into editing. We'll give you some basic equipment. And now whatever stories I don't get to put into the news that night, I sort of get a week to work on and put in a weekend show. And in the past few years, we've really been moving that one-way conversation to a two-way conversation. With the development and advancement of social media, no longer are we just waiting for that 3-minute slot at the end of the newscast to share that information out to the public. It's a two-way conversation on a multitude of platforms, and that is for better or for worse. For better, I've had the opportunity to connect with so many more scientists than I ever would have been before. Scientists are getting much more interested in communicating their work and sharing discussions online. Not that everyone has to, but there's definitely an open door there through social media. So I've made some amazing connections and have been connected to scientists so much faster after a breaking news event because of social media. The other part of the two-way conversation is I do get instant feedback from our audiences, listeners, and viewers. And that's both positive, getting storms verified as they happen, but also getting to hear what people are interested in, what solution-based stories people are working on, tips, but also the climate trolls and the just general internet trolls, which is something I continue to try and figure out how to work with. If somebody wants to engage with me in a conversation, then I'm more than happy to on social media. But a lot of the time there are, harsh comments that I have had to learn to block out or talk to other people in both the scientific and journalist world about how to deal with. But generally, the two-way conversation has been an amazing experience. And that has also helped experiment with science communication on different platforms. So I talked about the Science Smarts, but a few years ago, the newsroom was looking to get into podcasting. Before just as Serial was coming out and true crime was becoming really popular, CBC Vancouver newsroom thought, well, maybe we should experiment with podcasts. And so they sort of put this general call out and said, does anyone have a topic? When any one of the hosts or reporters have a topic that they're interested in? And that's when I suggested a podcast dedicated to what would happen to Vancouver when an earthquake hits, and sort of unfold it in real-time scenario. And that ended up being one of the projects that I am still most proud of, our Fault Lines podcast, which ended up winning both provincial and national awards, a 6-part series outlining the science and also the response from officials, where we were at 4 years ago when it comes to the science and the response. And that opened up doors to getting to do a climate change podcast a couple of years ago, 2050 Degrees of Change, the same sort of scenario, laying out what British Columbia will look like in a middle of the road carbon emission scenario in 2050, and getting to talk to the scientists and the experts and the stakeholders. Again, those were the two projects that I am most proud of. But it took hustling, and it always takes me getting to say, I've got an idea and I'm going to do it. And is anybody interested? And if you're listening as a student or, just starting off in your career, that is one of the biggest pieces of advice I can offer, is that if you've got an idea, then just do it. And it's much easier to find those 5 people that you need to make it happen after you've got the prototype, or ask where it could fit into an actual job after you've done it. Because if you've got a passion for something and you think that there is a niche in the world for it, then there probably is. So getting to do those 2 podcasts was pretty exciting. And since then, things have been put on hold a little bit because of the pandemic. But as we start to see the silver lining, and I know all of you are looking very, very close to the light at the end of the tunnel, a lot of these projects are looking to come back online. A follow-up series to 2050, and also a digital-first climate television show in the next year, which I'm also really excited about. But that shift in interest from the newsroom, 15 years ago, when climate change was just that last question we got asked, to one of the most important topics in our newsroom, it was a slow shift. And in some ways, it took the audience and the public demanding more climate change for the newsroom to really see that shift. In British Columbia, it happened after the back-to-back 2017-2018 record wildfire seasons. And for the first time, I think British Columbians anyway were affected across the entire province, whether or not the audience was one of the thousands of people that were evacuated from their homes for an entire summer, or we were just one of the millions of Vancouverites who ended up having to cancel all their summer plans because the smoke that moved in from the wildfires and ended up engulfing the heavily populated South Coast for weeks on end. That was the first time, I think, that we had more calls into our newsroom, more tweets, more emails from people wanting a greater connection to climate change in our coverage. than we did from the trolls. So that was a huge moment for me. We had more people wanting us to talk more about climate change than we did from climate deniers. And I think every part of Canada is seeing that shift in your own way. You know, in Ontario, it was a couple of years ago after the flooding. I think I really saw that switch. The Great Lakes were at their highest levels, and the flooding lingered on through the spring for months and months. And that was the first time that I saw that response shift in Ontario. Greater demand from the audience to talk more about climate change and to connect audiences with the science and the research that's being done at the universities and the institutions. So the shift is happening slowly but steadily, and that two-way conversation is such a big part of how that happens. Convincing the newsroom that there are many ways to talk about science continues to be an ongoing challenge. And again, the newsroom has fully bought in now. I mean, climate change is a huge part of our coverage, but there are so many ways to communicate now. I mentioned earlier, I won't ask how many people watch the evening news, because the way people are taking in news is changing at a rapid pace. So not only are we getting our news in different formats, but science literacy is just accelerating at an astounding rate. I'm seeing the basics of science being understood by more and more people. And I think no longer is it trying to convince audiences that climate change is real. It's now convincing them to take action and convincing the policymakers and the stakeholders, and again, connecting the audience with the science that is still happening. That the more we're learning and fine-tuning what we know about climate change, that continues to be such a big part of the storytelling. But whether that's a 2-minute piece on my evening national show, or a 40-minute podcast, or a 1-hour-long doc, or 140-character tweet, I think what I've learned as a science communicator is that the facts are always going to be at the heart of every story I tell. The facts and the peer-reviewed and the talking to a scientist to understand what is happening is always going to be the most important part of a science story. But there needs to be a heartbeat to really connect with the audience and for the audience to take ownership of these stories. And when I talk about heartbeat, that can be everything from, you know, following a science review, a science study with an actual solution-based story, something that community members are doing on the ground that offers that heartbeat to a story. Maybe it's talking to the scientists behind the research and figuring out their story, how long that they've been working at it, what kind of challenges and triumphs were they up against. Maybe it's just that 2-minute science story. I'm doing one tonight on a new study showing that heat waves in South Asia are going to triple by the middle of century with a 2-degree warming in a climate change. And I only have 2 minutes to tell this story. I've got a call with the lead author, I should say, in a couple of hours. And so for me, it's being able to weave that narrative and convincing the newsrooms where it fits into the bigger picture. So I managed to sneakily convince them to get it on the show tonight because of the record-breaking temperatures that are happening in Southern Ontario. And sometimes it's trying to find that segue, both for the audience and for our newsrooms. Obviously, the 20-degree temperatures in London and Toronto are not connected to Middle East heat waves, but the fact that everyone's talking about how hot it is today, the fact that there's big news on the carbon tax announcement out of the federal government, it's on people's minds. So it's a nice chance to talk about the bigger climate change picture and to connect people to some actual science that's happening on the ground. So today, that's my heartbeat. And for me, my job is to find that heartbeat in different ways every day. And I think that's going to continue to evolve. I'm excited to see where the next generation goes with science communication. I think it has not been an easy road for those scientists who are wanting to find a platform and wanting to find a way to communicate either. I have not delved into the world of TikTok yet, but I am seeing some fascinating ways that young scientists are using TikTok to share their research with a general public. And I think that it's only going to be exciting to get to work with and figure out where that road is going next. As far as where I'm going next, a couple of things happened. First of all, as we heard Alan mention, I got to write a couple of children's books, and that was the first time in my career, after all of this hustling and convincing that projects needed to happen and doing the work and then finding a role for it in my daily job anyway, I was approached by a children's publishing, a children's publishers out here in British Columbia. They approached me. I didn't have to do the hustling this time. And they said, we've seen your science work. We've seen your science communication. We're wondering if you'd be interested in writing some children's books, talking about science to first readers. And that, again, was the first time that had happened to me. I gladly said yes. I have one book on earthquakes for children and one on hurricanes. And I'm working right now on one about wildfires. So I think the more you put yourself out there and create these projects and create your dream job, the more it'll snowball after that. And one day that things will start turning around and coming to you. The other thing that I wanted to tell you that's happening for me, which goes full circle back to my first reviews on my honors thesis paper, I'm getting to work with scientists and stakeholders here in British Columbia on a big paper, a big report that will be presented to the government in partnership with Natural Resource Canada. And I will be the lead author on the media section. And what we're doing is presenting all of the hazards and the risks that are in place for British Columbia right now, both associated with climate change and our tectonic setting out here. And it's basically coming up with a report to show everyone, to show stakeholders in the government where we're at right now as far as the science and our recommendations moving forward. And so I've been asked to be the lead author on the media's roles and responsibilities. So I'm a little nervous for those first comments back from the reviewer, but this is pretty exciting for me. It's been a long time, other than the children's book publications, that I'm putting myself back out there into the academic world. So I may look for some tips and support from all of you who are listening as alumni. But it is exciting that my job gets to continually evolve and change as the landscape of my work continues to evolve and change. And I don't know where things will end up in the next 5 to 10 years, but I do know that climate change and science communication are only going to be more and more important. And just to end off talking about the last year, I know it's been a tough year for everyone as students get into the finishing line for final exams all remotely. And all of us are weirdly getting better on Zoom calls. Side note on that, it has been much easier for me to connect with scientists via Zoom. That has been a silver lining because of the pandemic. I think everyone is able to just jump on a call with me to talk about their science. So I hope that continues. But as we look towards the finish line, another thing I think happened during the pandemic that I'm hopeful continues forward, and that's this spotlight that was shone on science. You know, we're seeing, especially out here in British Columbia, we're seeing our scientists, our health scientists, speak and help make our policymakers and our politicians make decisions in the public eye. And for the first time, I think people who don't normally have an interest in science know the names of more scientists, and we know how important science is when making important decisions that affect everyone on a daily basis. And I hope that as we transition out of the pandemic and back into addressing climate change crisis and all of the interdisciplinary impacts that has, I hope that that spotlight stays on. And I am hopeful that, you know, we've all come through this together and we've all realized what we can do as a community, and whether that community is your fellow students, your campus, your city, your friends, your family, or the entire world coming together and coming through something. I hope that's the attitude that we can take when addressing the climate change crisis, and that spotlight continues to stay on in our our scientists and our science. And I hope that I can continue to help share that work and research. So thank you for letting me share how much I love my job. And like I said, I hope that I get to work with many of you in the future, or at least get to share your science down the road. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Johanna. That was fantastic. We are going to take questions. And so I just invite anyone who has a question for Johanna to please type it into the Q&A section, and we will unmute, or you can unmute your microphone, and then you can actually ask the question rather than me reading it out for you. So the first person I'll call on is our own geophysics rock star, Sherry Molnar, who is one of the new geophysicists in our department. who has a question about earthquakes and actually does quite a bit of work out in BC. So Sherry, can you ask your question?
Hello. I was asking what was your biggest pet peeve or maybe surprise in terms of communicating about earthquakes and climate change in Canada?
Oh, that's a great question. And also it's really nice to speak to you. I'm probably going to say this to every scientist at the university, but I'm also a big fan of yours, Sherry.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, I have a few pet peeves when it comes to communicating earthquakes and climate change. I think let's start with earthquakes. So let's see, which one do I hone in on? I do think both our newsrooms and the audiences I mentioned earlier are getting their science literacy is going up. But every time there's an earthquake somewhere in the world, and we get a couple of sort of back-to-back earthquakes, within a few days or a few weeks at either ends of the globe, ultimately, I see the headlines or the newsroom wanting to make the headlines. There's a cluster of earthquakes. They're all connected. Is this ramping up the risk for us in BC, regardless of where that earthquake is happening? And I do think it's always a nice chance when there is an earthquake happening anywhere around the world to talk about our local risks. But I feel like I have to every time explain how tectonic plates work from the beginning. So yes, that would be a bit of a pet peeve for earthquakes. And climate change, there's an interesting thing happening. As I mentioned, that this shift away from the climate deniers and towards climate supporters, but it's almost gone the extreme in the other way. There's so many people passionate about climate change, but maybe not with the full understanding of the science behind it. And a lot of times I get people wanting me to make the connection between climate change when it's just not there. And the big one is during hurricane season. We had a record number of hurricanes last year in the Atlantic. And so far the research tells us, the science tells us that climate change and global warming doesn't necessarily mean more hurricanes. And I've actually had a few trolls the other way saying, you should be standing up for climate science. Every time there's a hurricane, you should say there will be more of them because of climate change. So it's this balance between obviously trying to provide the right science, but also making sure that we're not just creating headlines. So yeah, those are probably the two biggest ones, I'd say.
Thank you very much. That's great. We have a question from another faculty member of the department, Cameron Sujita. Cameron, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, amazing story. I haven't seen you for years, so
I know.
nice to see you again.
Nice to see you.
It's been such a long time. Like, as somebody who also deals with the media and trolls quite a lot of the time, I was wondering if you touched on dealing with climate trolls, which you must deal with a whole lot in your work. So how do you deal with these people? Is there like a general approach that you take in dealing with them?
Yes.
I always find it very difficult.
I do too. And honestly, I hope that after this, we can, keep the dialogue up. I am on social media. So if anyone wants to share their tips, I'm looking for them as well. But I think where I'm at right now is if there is genuine engagement, if I get an email or a tweet back and it sounds like the person is coming from a place where they have some kind of understanding and they want to share what they think they know about it. And it seems like there's an open dialogue, then I will happily engage. So more often than not, I'll take that first step and respond and let them know where I got my research from and be respectful. And if it seems like after that it's not going to be a respectful engagement, then I'll just, shut her down. But sometimes I think that it is going to be a positive engagement, and it's not. And once things get nasty, I'm not afraid to block or just ignore emails. The bosses in the newsroom give me a hard time because we have an ombudsman. So you can send in official complaints to the CBC, and every official complaint, I probably shouldn't tell everyone this, has to be addressed by our ombudsman. And I think I probably get more than most because they're coming from climate deniers. But the one thing I've learned in dealing with deniers and trolls is that a lot of times they just want to be asked questions, and they're in a unique scenario that has led them to their thoughts and beliefs. So one tactic that I do find before I get to the blocking stage is to ask them questions about their background and their beliefs. And sometimes it's not actually about the science in the end. But I look forward to hearing anyone else's tips out there, because it is something that I deal with too.
Thank you. That's very interesting.
We have a question, I think, from Parshini Patel, who's one of our star outreach people in science. Maybe you could ask your question, Parshini.
Thank you, Neil. Really great story. Thank you for sharing your journey with us. I just had a couple of questions about getting into science journalism. What are the 3 tips you would have for someone who's just starting into this field of and trying to get opportunities of presenting their ideas and learning more? So any kind of internship opportunities or any tips you could give?
The world of science communication is so different now than it was, even a few years ago. There are even, postgraduate programs at many of our universities now in the realm of science communication and climate change leadership. So, many of these opportunities weren't there when I was going through my undergrad. So I guess my first tip is to look to see what is out there, because the field of science communication is just taking off. And now it is regarded as a field of science. So things are changing so quickly. Things are being created as we speak. I'm actually working with some professors out on Vancouver Island, hoping to create sort of a post-grad program in science journalism. So there might be something out there academically, but as far as just wanting to get into the field of science communication, I'd say putting yourself out there on social media is probably a good start. And for me, it was finding all of these different communities. Twitter is a great place to go. There's so many social media platforms, but Twitter is one that I find scientists really engage on. And I've spent a lot of time sort of going down these rabbit holes, finding a scientist, and then, Twitter will suggest 8 more scientists connected to them. And, I follow thousands of scientists now that I've sort of put into these different lists based on their interdisciplinary fields. And I'll spend, entire hour just going through the seismic list, seeing what the latest research is or topic or banter happening between scientists. And so connecting, I think, to that world is probably a great first step. And then just practicing at the science communication level. So whether it's using your own work, trying to put it into a 2-minute video, it doesn't have to be on social media, but just practicing putting your work into shorter and more condensed versions or different formats that you might not expect. And as far as opportunities for mentorship, I think there are a lot of opportunities now within newsrooms who are looking for scientists. More and more, I think newsrooms are realizing the value of having a scientist on staff and in the newsroom to be able to be that liaison between staff and newsrooms. So if anyone's watching and is interested, feel free to reach out to me, and I'll connect you as best I can. But it's an exciting field to be in.
Thank you.
And just a shout out to all the outreach work that Parshini does for the Space Institute and for the university just in general. We have an interesting question from Kieran. Kieran, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yes, please. I was just wondering, you were talking about climate deniers and interacting with them on social media, but I was wondering if you'd ever encountered any of them within the CBC, and if you'd ever had issues.
Yeah, really interesting question. I have been lucky that I haven't come up against any straight up climate deniers at the CBC. It was an interesting and big moment a couple of years ago when we sort of followed suit after the BBC announced this policy. We had a big, every couple of years, everyone at the CBC sort of meets through different dialogue discussions to talk about what our latest journalistic standards and practices are. Are there any changes to the way that we do our work and our journalism? And a couple of years ago, the big one was almost like just to make sure everyone knows, we don't have to tell both sides of the climate story, because there is no other side. So that was big, having that actually written into our journalistic standards and practice, that we don't have to, when we're talking about a story about climate change, find somebody who doesn't believe in it. I think at that point it was obvious, but to have that written in was a big moment. I will say though that I have come up against producers and directors and writers who not necessarily don't believe in it, but don't believe that it's a big story. And it's been interesting for me to see those. Obviously, I won't name any names. I'll wait for my tell-all to come out in a few years. I think it's been interesting for me to see the rapid shift in the newsroom when all of a sudden we're realizing that demand from our audience and we're almost trying to play catch up. And I believe that CBC is a leader. I mean, obviously I'm biased on that front, but I think that we are a leader amongst news organizations in telling the climate change story. But I think many of the producers who 5 years ago were saying, Johanna, no one wants to listen to another climate change story, are now saying, can you do that 6-part special we were talking about? It's what people want, So things are changing quickly. And I think that I'm lucky I haven't come up against any deniers, but it's convincing people on the importance.
Thank you. We have a question from Peter Jedicke. Peter, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Thank you very much, Neil. I'm just wondering if Johanna has any thoughts on how metric acceptance, let's call it, is proceeding in Canada. Do we find that folks are more willing and capable of using the metric system, or do we still get our folks rolling their eyes and shrugging whenever we use metric quantities?
Yeah, interesting question. Generally, I mean, the CBC, it was hammered into me early on that it is definitely metric, but I do find the one that people still have a hard time, especially as a meteorologist, getting to talk about precipitation amounts, is the inches versus millimeters. And sometimes, and for snowfall, the centimeters versus feet. And sometimes, I'll always use the metric first, but I realize that if something's approaching, a foot or 2 feet, I can throw it in for those people who are still wanting that metrics, that wanting the other side of it. But generally, no, it's pretty well accepted now, I think. At least I don't see the eye rolls. Maybe I'm protected from that. The one that was interesting was at the first year working at the CBC, I was used to saying kilometers. And I mean, again, going back to that standards journalistic and practice, everything is written down, and it's actually the CBC pronunciation is kilometers. So I remember having to drill that into my head that it was kilometers, writing it down. So I think I've got that one, but luckily no eye rolls in general.
Great. Alyssa, do you want to ask your question?
Lisa, thanks, Neil. So I have a question when it comes to science stories and where you get the information for science stories. Basically, it goes, does the CBC have subscriptions to large journals and access to things like Elsevier's publications? Or does the information for your science stories mostly come from social media when it first gets released by scientists?
Yeah, that's a great question. We do have subscriptions to all the big journals. Interestingly, that has also changed. I remember a few years ago, when I was back in Toronto at the Weather Center, I mean, the meteorologist sort of got subscriptions to CMOS, and I convinced them to get CGU as well. But I think that's changing as our interest in science communication changes. And really just in the past few years, we've always had a science and tech unit, but in the past couple of years, we've realized how important that is. And we now have a full science unit with climate change as a priority. We're hiring more and more staff scientists as writers. And I think organically, we've sort of subscribed to more and more papers. And even just a couple of weeks ago, somebody shared an embargoed paper with me from an alert system that I hadn't heard from. And I said, oh, can you add me onto the list? And vice versa. Sometimes, it was a few years ago as well. I said, well, can we subscribe officially to AGU? And CBC said, will tell us why and give us the value, and then we will. So it is an organic process, but most of the stories do come from these journals and the embargoed press releases. We love a good embargoed study. I'm not sure why, but I mean, I know why, but it's funny how sometimes the excitement of something being embargoed really holds weight to the newsroom. And then sometimes it is social media. There's just more of a buzz happening around a story than I expected. Maybe I saw the alert, but wasn't sure quite how to tell the story. And then I see that scientists are talking about it, sharing conversation, and maybe a couple days later, I'll repitch it.
Thank you. We have a question from Lisa Capelli. Lisa.
Hi, I was just wondering if you have a lot of pressure to sensationalize stories, and if so, how you balance that.
Yes, I don't get that kind of pressure at the CBC. I think maybe some other news organizations, maybe at one point, especially when it comes to online headlines, you know, we went through a period where even at CBC, clickbait was alluring, and trying to find that, you know, 5 reasons why you should read this climate change study was at one point, it was all the rage in the newsrooms. But I'm glad that I'm now sort of treated with the respect as a newsroom scientist. So all of the science headlines, both for online and, you know, for the banners, they try and run by me. And I mean, sometimes they get by and they are not quite right. And then, you know, I'll get an email back from the scientist saying, can you help fix this? So we don't always nail it, because it is a balance trying to get the science out while still enticing the public to listen to the story. And it goes back to trying to find that heartbeat of the story. And I do find it sometimes a struggle, you know, with science, as you know, there are always uncertainties, and there are always very long thesis titles, and trying to put that down into, you know, 5 words that'll fit on a banner. I still struggle with making sure I'm maintaining the right science while getting people's attention. So I don't feel the pressure from the news organization, but I do feel it personally to get it right.
Great. We have a question from David Sills. David, do you want to ask your question?
Hi, David.
Hi, Johanna. How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Okay, great. Question is, given you're increasingly well-known and recognizable, is there tension between remaining a newsroom scientist and becoming a more prominent newsroom personality, such as an anchor? Is it hard to remain grounded in science when you're surrounded by the broadcast media types?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I will continue to seek your work, your expertise on tornadoes every time something comes up. You're not getting away. Yes, I do find a little bit of pressure. I think I'll sort of take you back to the idea that CBC was only hiring meteorologists. And we kind of went through this phase, I mean, you probably know this well, where there was sort of this window, I think, where some journalists were realizing, young journalists were realizing maybe the way to get into journalism was through meteorology. And, you know, I mean, there are some great online programs, but coming in from a non-scientific background, wanting to go through meteorology, but then coming back to the anchor side of things. So, and I remember during that time feeling conflicted, because I wanted people to get into meteorology, and I liked the idea of people realizing halfway through their career that they wanted to go back to science and finding a passion in meteorology, but then wanting to make sure it was, you know, for the right reasons as far as science communication. But I think that I'm lucky that the newsroom, again, realizes that there's value in having a scientist. And they've never tried to get me to do general news. You know, I think a lot of the times general news stories have a science angle. And so it's not just talking about the science, but about the response and what's happening on the ground and the rescues. So sometimes my science stories are more about the big picture, and there are definitely news components. But I'm lucky that I haven't felt that pressure or want. I really love getting to be a science communicator.
We have a few more minutes left, so we'll take a few more questions, but I'm sorry in advance if I don't get to your question. So we have a question on science literacy from Rick Secco.
Hi, Johanna. Nice to see you. Thank you for a great talk.
Nice to see you.
I was really interested to hear your comments, your views on the increasing science literacy of the public, because, you know, many years ago during my first sabbatical in Germany, and then later another sabbatical in Japan, my general impressions when I left these two places was that the public there was quite well versed in things scientific, generally, at least compared to Canadians. And so I've thought about this for a while, but I'm interested to see that with your excellent science journalism and you know, that of others, that, you know, science literacy is on the rise for the public in Canada. So it's more of a comment than a question.
Yeah, that's interesting that you've thought about it too. And side note, this is very exciting for me to get to talk to my undergrad professors and colleagues and scientists that I look up to. But yes, the idea that science literacy is increasing, I've also thought a lot about, because I mean, I also have to be careful and know that I am in a bit of a bubble. You know, my bubble is mainly CBC audiences and the sort of social media realm that I'm in, which, you know, are made up of a lot of scientists and climate change scientists. But I do think when looking at the kind of feedback that we're getting in our own newsroom from general audiences, that the more we sort of oversaturate them, which has sort of been my MO up to now, to try and saturate every news program we have with more science stories and more climate change, and, you know, sort of sneak into every platform that we can, some kind of a connection to a science story, and then, you know, slowly over time the audience is learning together. I also, my husband, who I met at the CBC in Toronto, who now works for the competitor at Global, we often share these kinds of ideas. You know, how are the audiences changing, and how are their demands and understanding of science stories changing? And he's seen it too over at Global. Again, this idea that people want more science and more explanation. And we do have big research groups at CBC as well. You know, we put out the groups to try and figure out what people are interested in. And I think the last big one we did was a couple of years ago, and there were 5 big topics that people wanted more of in news. And I think number 2 on the list was climate change and science stories. So I'm hopeful that it is really happening.
That's great. It really sounds like we're past the tipping point. So thank you.
I hope so.
Well, thank you, everybody. Unfortunately, Johanna does have a job to do today and has to get to the newsroom. So I'd like to thank you again for the talk, and I will ask the Dean of Science, Matt Davison, to close the event.
Thank you so much for being our 2021 Scugog lecturer and for sharing such a personal set of stories with us today, Johanna. You really underline both the importance of and the opportunities for science communication and journalism. Your super engaging talk points to the centrality of your background in earth sciences to the key issues of the day, including climate change and natural hazards such as earthquakes, tornadoes, forest fires, and flood. We are in the middle of a university strategic planning exercise right now, and these topics are emerging from the entire Western community, both inside and outside science, as research priorities for our university. I also loved how you shared your ability in matching your skills to solving new problems and in generating creative approaches to getting your message out there. Your description of the way in which you've made your own luck to accomplish creative things was a real example for us all, students, new grads, and grizzled veterans alike. I suppose that once you've mastered calculus while living at Saugeen, you can do anything. Johanna, on behalf of the Department of Earth Sciences, the Faculty of Science, and of Western, thank you so much for your inspiring talk today.
Thank you so much for having me. I hope to see everyone in person soon.
Thank you so much,
Right,
Johanna.
everyone.
We will be sending you a small token of our thanks, which is a Earth Sciences mug that you can proudly display on your news desk once you're able to get back into the office.
It's going on the live shot as soon as I get it.
Perfect.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us for the 2021 Scugog lecture. And thank you, Johanna, so much for being our distinguished speaker.
Thank you for having me. And watch out for the rain tonight. Special weather statement in place.
Bye, everyone.